U.S. History, Lesson 35, The Origins of the Cold War. In our previous lessons, we discussed the conclusions of the Second World War, which had ended in the triumph of the Allies, or in Churchill's phrase, the Grand Alliance. Specifically, Great Britain, the United States, and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, aka the Soviet Union. For the United States, though, as the war ends, this is in many ways not unlike the Civil War with its beginning and conclusion. It's a threshold moment. If you would have gone back in a time machine from 1945 and gone back just 6-7 years early, go back to say like 1938, and you would have told the average American on the street that just half a dozen years from now, a little over that, the United States will possess the world's largest air force, the world's largest navy, we'll have an industrial economy that is second to none, we'll have full employment, even underemployment, we'll have more jobs than we have people for them, we'll possess a massive land army, we'll also be largely victorious in all of our wartime efforts, and be a dominant superpower of the globe that also is at this time the only possessor of nuclear weaponry on the entire planet. People would have looked at you like you were from an alien culture. It simply would not have been the reality that people saw in 1938. Not unlike how 1859 is going to look so different than 1865 for the Americans who lived before, during, and after that time. Everything after, in many ways, seems so different than everything before. But to look at the origins of the Cold War, which is obviously, as compared to a hot war, it's a war without shooting, or a war by other means between these two great powers, historians have spent an awful lot of time trying to figure out, was the Cold War truly necessary? Was it unavoidable in many ways? And the theme of this lecture will be seeing how we got from allies to antagonists in this period from about 45 to 53 that we're discussing now. And part of this you have to back up to look at the uneasy relations the United States had had with the Soviet Union since the birth of the Soviet Union in 1917. The United States and the Soviets had very different perspectives on world affairs, even going all the way back to the World War I. The United States, as you'll recall from your classes in our earlier units, the United States entered World War I for ideals. It was going to fight the war to end all wars, a war to make the world safe for democracy. In many ways, it was Woodrow Wilson's highlight of the progressive era. It was the most progressive act that could be done. The Soviets, for their part, they take over through the Russian Revolution by deposing the old Tsarist imperial Russian regime. And when they ultimately withdraw from the war, they bail out on the Allies in World War I, withdrawing from the war to deal with their own internal conflicts. And at the same time they do that, they embarrass the Allies. They expose their secret war aims that all the great European powers had, exposing their secret treaties and plans for after the war. And in many ways, Wilson's 14 points were put forward and championed by the Allied cause in 1918 as a counter to the Soviet charges of the capitalist nations all plotting to simply carve up the globe in a different manner. So there had been an antagonism with the Allies and the Soviets even in the post-World War I period as well. After World War I, the Allies invaded the Soviet Union, actually. They deployed troops, American troops as well, to Russia in 1919 and 1920 as a part of taking sides in the Russian Civil War between the red or Bolshevik Russians and the so-called white Russians, or the Russians that wanted to try to form a democratic state. The Bolsheviks, the Soviet Russians, they ultimately win. But as we've always talked about, realpolitik, pursuing a foreign policy dedicated to your own self-interests, by backing the losing side, which the Western powers, including the United States, did, it's going to color or prejudice the Soviet view of the Western democracies, because from the Soviet point of view, the Western democracies tried to strangle this nation they were building while it was in its cradle. And they didn't forget that once they were on top again. So in the Civil War, the Allies backed the opposing side to the side that ultimately won. Furthermore, in the League of Nations, the Soviet Union is isolated. They're not even invited to join. They were kept deliberately out of it. And so then this is going to create a non-fertile environment for healthy relationships between these two nations, the United States and the Soviets. In 1933-1934, Franklin Roosevelt ultimately opens diplomatic relations with Russia. Or the Soviet Union. He figures that trade could be helpful for us during this time of economic depression, and it's a mighty big nation on the map to ignore in any case. But it's not a warm relationship by any stretch. It's quite frosty and quite a minimalist relationship. Now, the impact of the Second World War upon these relations is obviously the Allies, the British, the Americans, and the Russians are thrown together. They're thrown together in what your second slide talks about, the historical nature of coalition warfare. And this is, in many ways you could argue, almost inevitable that you'll see these two great powers become antagonistic in the post-war period. During the war, they had a glue that bonded them together very tightly. That glue was necessity. Survival was going to bond the big three, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, together for the duration of the conflict. However, they needed each other. However, as the war goes on and becomes clearer and clearer and clearer that the Allies are going to win, they begin to need each other that much less. And you start to have dissension within this alliance and tensions within it. All coalition warfare generally has this trait that whichever side winds up being the victorious side in the coalition war, there usually winds up being friction within the coalition, because the common bond that held them together, which was fear of this other group, that other group's been erased, so there goes your common bond. And you start to have separations into separate spheres of interest, separate priorities. This happened to the Allies, the coalitions that fought against Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. It's not a unique thing by any stretch in international history of international relations. So there were different consequences for each side during the war. There were different experiences for each side during the war that were going to really affect the way that they saw the world after the war. And this is very important. You've got to get into the heads of both governing bodies of these respective nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, to understand why they saw the world the way they did. For the United States, the war actually brought prosperity. It lifted us out of the muck and mire of depression. Granted, there were casualties, but at home, the United States suffered virtually no sizable invasion of our domestic territory and borders, no economic dislocations on the negative end, at least. It put the economy back to work, gave people work, and really the United States is one of the few nations that exits World War II in a better situation than it enters the war. The Soviet Union, for their part, they actually suffered fantastic losses. The war for the Russians was a fight to the finish that they barely finished. They won World War II in the same way that you win a marathon. You run 26 miles in a row, you're a winner because you finished. You survived the ordeal. And the Russians lost 20 million casualties in the Second World War, civilian and military. It's a fantastically brutal struggle for them. A lot of the struggle takes place on their soil. Their economy, their cities, their infrastructure, their industry, it's all terribly devastated. And each of these different worldviews, the United States coming out better than we entered the war, and the Russians enduring a victory of survival, it's going to color or shape their vision for what should follow. For the United States, the vision is one of optimism. The post-war world, we're hoping to establish what was loosely called at the time the American century, a world where ideas of trade, self-determination for peoples, and end to colonialism and business expansion and social political rights were all going to be promoted. America was going to hopefully lead globally, we thought, in politics. This is going to be different than after 1918. We're going to learn the lessons of the past, lead in politics and economics. We want stability, we want international harmony, we want collective security, and it's going to be a world, hopefully, a new, bright, shiny, optimistic world of international cooperation and hegemony, if you will. The Soviets, for their part, could not view things more differently. The post-war world was not about cooperation with anyone on the outside. It was about securing themselves and piling up the sandbags for what may come next. Since they'd lost 20 million people in the First World War, or the Second World War rather, the Russians did not view this as an isolated incident. It was part of a continuum. They had suffered, they'd paid through 3 great invasions in the past 150 years. Napoleon Bonaparte in the early 1800s, the Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany in World War I, and then, of course, Adolf Hitler and the Nazis in World War II. So the paranoia the Russians felt towards the outside world was somewhat justifiable. If you're paranoid, it's a mental condition where you believe somebody's out to get you. But see, if you believe somebody's out to get you and somebody's actually out to get you, maybe you're really not that paranoid after all. And so from the Russian point of view, this was not paranoia. This was simply, as they said, look at the past historical record. This is seeing the world as the world is there to be seen. From the Soviet point of view, these so-called democracies, the people of Western Europe, they were simply crazy. And it seemed like peace to them was simply an interval resting time between when the next great wave of invasions would come. So the Soviets, for their part, they want what they're going to reference as being satellite states. In other words, the Russians want to create a giant speed bump. They want to control the governments of all these nations here of Eastern Europe. They want to control those governments and have those governments sympathetic to the Soviet Union. The idea being that when the fourth or fifth or sixth great invasion from the West comes, the Russians say, well, those nations have to smash their way through this buffer state, a giant speed bump, if you will, that they're going to put up in Eastern Europe, and by the time that happens, the Soviets figure they can mobilize all their Russian forces and be ready and stop the Western hordes at the gates of the Soviet Union instead of stopping them somewhere at the gates of Moscow. So this is Russian or Soviet thinking on why they want control over these nations of Eastern Europe. They want to make Eastern Europe very much their sphere of influence. And it doesn't help if you compound this with the fact that Joseph Stalin, for his part, pretty much a real case can be made that he was a paranoid, delusional maniac. He was the ultimate in totalitarian rulers. The man himself purged or liquidated, executed some 8 million of his own people in the 1930s, including his own army's general staff. And so his fears were for his own position, as he saw enemies everywhere, but also for what he saw as being capitalist encirclement, a Russia, a Soviet Union that was somehow bottled up and contained. So he wants borders in many ways as a borders and speed bumps and protections and barriers on those borders against further Western invasions. So as the war ends, there's a series of issues that are unresolved. The end of the war is leading the Allies more and more towards their break here. The American foreign policy establishment, American people have to gradually come to this conclusion that Soviet and American visions, for lack of a better term, the way that things ought to be, these were radically different visions. And as such, from 1944 to 1947, Soviet-American relations and perceptions undergo a tremendous transformation from heroic ally in the cause against Nazism to totalitarian enemy that's bent on world domination. And this is a big change in American thinking that has to take place in a very short period of time. The end-of-war conferences are where, in many ways, this template gets set out. In Yalta in 1945, as had been discussed in our previous lessons on the Second World War, and your history classes as well, a very un-Wilsonian idea transpired. You had secret diplomacy. The fate of weak nations like Poland and China was being discussed by the Big Three without their consent. The Western nations, the British and the Americans, were pushing for representative governments in all of Europe, governments that were determined by those local peoples on the ground. The Soviet Union was bound and determined not to let this happen. So they may have promised it, but the fact that they had boots on the ground in those areas and we didn't was going to dictate that these were promises that'd be unfulfilled. The United States and Great Britain are hardly in a position to do much about this. By the time you get to Potsdam then, in August of 1945, Franklin Roosevelt is dead. Winston Churchill has been replaced through the parliamentary election process. A new party has taken power in Britain, and so Clement Attlee is the prime minister representing Britain at that point. Joseph Stalin still remains. And so you've got three leaders that don't know each other very well, Stalin being the one with the greatest credibility in terms of the longest standing of the three, who'd waged his way out through the war as well. And so Stalin in many ways tried to press Truman, to try to bully him and gain concessions. Truman, for his part, this didn't play into, it played into confirming his suspicions that the best way to deal with the Soviets was to stand up to them firmly. Anything that they wanted to bully with had to be pushed back against. And so this was going to really set up some ramifications for the post-war world. At Potsdam, it's decided the reparations question for Germany is dealt with somewhat. The idea of breaking Germany into areas of occupation by the four major Allied powers, the British, the French were at this point, the Americans and the Russians, and plans for the Soviet Union to enter the war and perhaps divide up in the Far East as well in the war with Japan. But increasingly, you're seeing the origins of a bipolar dynamic. And by this, I mean a two-power struggle for European and global supremacy between the West, the Western pole, led by the United States, and then the Eastern pole, or Soviet pole, led by the Soviet Union.